the Mud Volcano. For over 15 years, a volcano in Indonesia has been spewing something that might surprise you. Indonesia is one of the scariest places to live in the world, primarily because the country is crowded by volcanoes that could go off at any second and kill everybody. But not all the volcanoes spit fire and ash. For example, take a look at the world's most destructive volcano that oozes mud. On May 29, 2006, the Lucy Mud Volcano near the town of Sidoarjo began to spew out a devastating amount of mud. In fact, there was so much mud every day that entire villages were being buried under 130 feet of thick muck. At the start of the eruption, about 60,000 people lost their homes to the mud, and over a decade later, scientists are still baffled as to how mud continues to ooze out of the volcano. It's the biggest mud volcano that can be found anywhere in the world, and it hasn't stopped erupting in nearly 20 years. Scientists have put the blame on a natural gas drilling operation that went wrong in 2006. However, the drilling company shifted the blame to an earthquake that they said happened. But whatever its cause may be, the mud continues to flow. And it's not expected to stop pushing mud from its mouth for another 30 years. To combat the problem and save the people who live along the edges of the destruction, special embankments were built in 2008. But there are still floods, and mud occasionally disrupts local highways and villages. Scientists also say it's possible that the mud could start flowing uncontrollably at any time, causing an entirely new disaster. It's not ordinary mud either. This is superheated mud that acts like hot lava. And now for number 9. But first, it's shoutout time. I want to give a big thank you to Deepscapes, Stiffixia, and Shelby for supporting this channel. I'm so lucky to have amazing viewers like you guys. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already to join the Origins Explained family. We've got it all. The Cave of Crystals. There is a cave full of giant crystals in Mexico that is beautiful but deadly. It's not particularly claustrophobic, but the cave is so hot and so humid that it can turn you into a mummy in a matter of minutes. The cavern is located underneath Mexico's Sierra de Naica mountain at a depth of around 1,000 feet. Inside the caves are enormous crystals of pure gypsum, a material that's been used by humans for thousands of years in plaster, concrete, and soil fertilizer. The enormous gypsum pillars stick out of the floor, walls, and ceilings of the cave. They make the place look like a cavern of lost treasure, but there's no treasure down here. In reality, the crystalline pillars, which have been growing for at least 500,000 years, are a death trap. Underneath the mountain is a regional fault line, and 26 million years ago, magma began to push through that fault line toward the surface of the planet. This led to the creation of the mountain, and it helped give birth to the preposterously big crystals. Then, when all was said and done, the cavern of crystals was formed, but the magma is still underneath, and its heat continues to seep up into the cave. The temperature within the crystal cavern is a steady 113 degrees Fahrenheit. The humidity level also hovers at around 100%. It's so hot within that if you were to enter without wearing a protective suit, your bodily fluids would condense into your lungs and you'd die. The only way to explore the cave is by breathing through a special respirator that supplies chilled air. But even still, most can't stand to be in the cave for more than 15 minutes. And you need a special permit. Mount Hua Plank Road. One of the most dangerous hiking trails in the world is carved into the side of a mountain in China. It's called the Huashan Trail, most of which isn't necessarily deadly. It's a section of the trail called the Mount Hua Plank Road that's rumored to kill 100 people every year. Huashan Mountain is one of the 5 greatest mountains in China. It's been a sacred place for thousands of years, attracting pilgrims who wish to scale the mountain and meditate at one of its 5 peaks. Each peak was once home to several temples, although most of them were destroyed and lost to time. It's also said that the original founder of Taoism once lived somewhere on the foggy mountain. The hiking trail was created by monks who started scaling the mountain centuries ago. Slowly but surely, they carved a network of stairs and trails leading to the various peaks of the mountain. However, these trails weren't up to modern standards by any stretch of the imagination, so Chinese authorities have made a few improvements, but the place is still deadly. The Hua Plank Road section is the scariest, but it's a necessary feat to conquer if one wants to reach the South Peak. The path is, as the name suggests, made of planks. Mediocre wooden planks stretch along the edge of a sheer cliff face. Climbers have less than a foot of width to move along the trail, and they're forced to aggressively hug the rock while trying not to look down. It's incredibly dangerous with no way of securing yourself and every opportunity to get vertigo and fall to your doom. Bikini Atoll. Bikini Atoll is one of the most radioactive islands in the world. It's located in the Pacific Ocean, surrounded by 23 small coral islands. It's part of the larger Marshall Islands, situated right in the middle between Hawaii and the Philippines. The U.S. government took administrative control here in 1944, though the Marshall Islands gained independence in 1986. Before they gained independence, though, the U.S. used the Marshall Islands and Bikini Atoll for bomb testing. Tests started in 1946, right after World War II. Over 20 nuclear devices were detonated at Bikini Atoll and a few other islands in the area. Today, the radioactive waste from these tests is buried under a giant concrete dome. Although the dome is still there to shield most of the radiation, Bikini Atoll is considered a toxic time bomb. It's the last place you'd want to have a tropical vacation, and playing in the sand here could leave you suffering from radioactive toxicity. The Congo River. The Congo River is one of the most dangerous waterways on the planet. It's also the most important river in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It acts as a superhighway, and it's used to transport individuals across the vast nation. People prefer the river over airplanes, making the barges and ferries the main kind of transport across such an extensive and wild place. Boat operators try to make as much money as they can, often transporting people on ships not designed for passengers. People sleep on piles of wood or next to dead fish. It's a terrible way to travel, and it often costs people their lives. Recently on the Congo River, a fire broke out on a boat, causing the vessel to capsize. When local fishermen came across the drowning passengers, instead of saving them, they beat them with oars. Then the fishermen looted goods from the sinking ship. About 200 people died as a result. And on the same day, in a different part of the Congo River, a boat traveling at night with no light hit a rock and about 70 people drowned. But traveling along the river isn't the only danger. There are also the creatures that lurk in its depths. The Congo River is the deepest river on the planet and the second largest river in the world for discharge volume. The river is so big in some places that it's easily mistaken for an ocean. It's positively massive and also contains over 300 species of fish, some of which are deadly. There are catfish so big they can swallow an entire person. There are vicious Goliath tigerfish with teeth capable of tearing flesh. There are also crocodiles, snakes, and there's supposedly a dinosaur named Mokele Mbembe. The Poison Garden. The most venomous plant in the world is the Gimpy tree. Simply touching the tree is the equivalent of being burned with hot acid while also being electrocuted. It's the mother of all dangerous plants, and it was recently added to a collection of nightmarish herbs and flowers at the Alwick Poison Garden in England. The garden is home to about 100 toxic and narcotic plants, including some you might be familiar with. They have the opium poppy and marijuana plants, but they also have plants that were used by alchemists in the Middle Ages to create deadly elixirs, plants like belladonna, atropa, and laburnum. And now they've added the Gimpy tree to their collection, which is also called the Australian stinging tree. The tree is covered in tiny nettles, which cause unimaginable pain when touched. The tree is native to Australia, and it was first discovered in 1866. That's when a road surveyor's horse brushed up against the plant, then went insane and was dead within 2 hours. The tiny nettles stick in human skin and can cause irritation for up to a year. The nettles are like needles, and they are almost impossible to get out of human flesh. If they are just lightly brushed, they create a burning sensation that intensifies for about 30 minutes, then keeps going for months. It's one of the worst pains known to humankind. And now the plant is kept behind an iron gate in England's deadliest garden. The Highway of Tears. The Highway of Tears is one of Canada's greatest shameful secrets. It's a stretch of road that runs 450 miles between Prince Rupert and Prince George in the province of British Columbia. It's officially called Highway 16, but it earned its gruesome nickname because of how many people have disappeared on the road over the past 50 years. Official sources say the number of victims on the Highway of Tears is only 20, but activists have claimed that the real number is closer to 600. Some victims are found on the side of the road torn to shreds, while others are never found. The people who go missing on the Highway of Tears are almost exclusively Indigenous women and young Indigenous girls. Something is happening in this remote stretch of Canadian highway, something nefarious and evil. Along Highway 16, there are roughly 23 First Nations communities. These are the communities that have experienced the most losses. According to the international organization Human Rights Watch, British Columbia has the highest number of unsolved murders of Indigenous women in the country. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police have been investigating the disappearances since 1981. But despite their best efforts, which activists say is seriously lacking, women continue to disappear. One of the most famous cases was Colleen McMillan in 1974. She embarked upon a journey to visit a friend, only to be discovered dead a month later. DNA evidence would later convict Bobby Jack Fowler as Colleen's killer. He was a serial killer who preyed on lonely women. And another killer who's believed to have hunted along the highway was Gary Taylor Handlin. He was responsible for the death of Monica Jack in 1978 and was only caught in 2019 because he accidentally confessed to an undercover cop. Even in today's modern society, it's believed that the Highway of Tears has become a hotbed of vicious Canadian serial killers. The Boiling Lake. On the mountainous Caribbean island of Dominica is a lake that reaches insane temperatures between 180 and 197 degrees Fahrenheit. Its actual name is Boiling Lake, and it's located in a place called the Valley of Desolation. Doesn't really sound like the kind of place you'd want to go for a bit of rest and relaxation. The Boiling Lake is 200 feet wide, but nobody knows how deep it really goes. The lake is constantly shrouded by swirling vapor clouds, making it look like a boiling witch's cauldron. The water is superheated because of the molten magma lurking below in the heart of the volcano. Although it's technically a lake, it's located inside the flooded fumarole, or the opening, of a restless volcano. Dangers aside, Boiling Lake is a breathtaking place to visit. You're able to hike to its edge, to the peak of the volcano, where you're gifted with beautiful views of the ocean beyond. You can even see the neighboring island of Martinique. It's a truly prehistoric landscape where lizards skitter over rocks and insects try to steal your blood. Just be careful you don't fall into the lake because there is no way out, and the water will boil you alive. Most dangerous path in the world. The Caminito del Rey path in Spain isn't quite as terrifying as the Plank Road of Death in China, but it is considered one of the most dangerous pathways in the world. In 2001, it closed to tourists after 5 people died. It then remained unused for the next 14 years while authorities in Spain made the path safer. It was finally reopened in 2015, and now it's a lot harder to die on the trail. Tourists must wear a hard hat while they travel the 5-mile-long walkway. The pathway has also been bolted to the face of the rock using steel poles. That way it won't give out. It's not nearly as treacherous as it was prior to 2015, but the journey is still a harrowing one. Before renovations, if you missed your step, you were dead. The pathway was about 3 feet wide and opened directly to nothing. One misstep and you were tumbling 300 feet down into the gorge below, where you'd surely perish. That's been fixed though with ropes and mesh to keep people on the path instead of at the bottom of the gorge. If you ever find yourself in Malaga and choose to travel the death-defying path, you better be prepared to finish it. You are not allowed to turn back. So once you start, you have to keep going. Mount Nyiragongo. The Democratic Republic of the Congo is home to one of the most dangerous rivers in the world, but it's also home to one of the most dangerous volcanoes on the planet. The volcano is called Mount Nyiragongo, and it's one of the few places on Earth that boasts an actual lake of bubbling lava at its summit. The volcano constantly erupts and kills people. It happens so often that it's mind-boggling that people still live within its shadow. In 1977, 2,000 people were killed when lava started pouring down its sides. Then, in 2002, molten rock obliterated a portion of the nearby city of Goma. As a result, 20,000 people were left homeless and 250 people lost their lives. If they weren't killed by carbon dioxide asphyxiation, they were straight up swallowed by lava. Benoit Smets, an expert on geohazards at the Royal Museum for Central Africa in Belgium, called it one of the most dangerous volcanoes in Africa. When it does erupt, lava manages to move at an astounding 40 miles an hour. Even with such present danger, Goma still has 1.5 million people living in it, and the city is only 6 miles from the volcano. Thanks for watching! Be sure to stay tuned for extra content you might have missed. Cape Tribulation, Australia. Australia's remote northeast region is filled with tropical rainforests containing lush vegetation, flowing rivers, and dazzling waterfalls, standing in stark contrast to the country's infamously dry and barren outback. There's also a series of beaches just miles from the edge of the Great Barrier Reef, including Cape Tribulation. This paradise draws many people who want to experience its natural beauty, but that beauty can also kill you. Located in far northern Queensland, Cape Tribulation is bordered by the Daintree rainforest, a 135-million-year-old rainforest which is rife with endemic wildlife and plants, including saltwater crocodiles and dangerous snakes. There are also stinging trees that have red berries and seem harmless, but just one touch lodges thousands of glass-like shards into your skin, causing a stinging and itching sensation that can last for months. If the trees don't get you, though, the wait-a-while bush might. It's a long vine with spikes that stick to just about everything, including your clothing, skin, and hair, and just don't let go. But the dangers don't end at the shoreline. The beach at Cape Tribulation is beautiful but potentially deadly. Every year between October and early June, thousands of small, crystal-clear box jellyfish flock to the warm, shallow waters. Just one sting from a box jellyfish can kill a person within minutes, and the experience is traumatic and excruciating, whether a sting victim survives or not. The common advice for avoiding a box jellyfish sting is to simply avoid going into the water at times when they're known to have an abundant presence, or to limit your swimming to an area protected by a net to keep the jellyfish out. Visitors also risk encountering wild boars in the Daintree rainforest and at Cape Tribulation. While boars don't usually attack humans, like any wild creature, they will defend themselves by charging straight at you if they feel cornered or threatened. So as long as you don't go in the water, don't touch any plants, and keep an eye out for crocodiles tracking you down, wild boar, snakes, and spiders, you should be good. Bolivia's Death Road. Commonly featured on lists of the world's most dangerous routes, Bolivia's Yungas Road connects the town of Coroico in the Amazonian low-lying Yungas region with La Paz, the capital city. The 43-mile road, which is no wider than 10 feet at most points, is infamous for its fog-obstructed views, hairpin turns, landslides, and steep cliffs along the side. As you travel along, you'll notice numerous crosses on the roadside, left in memory of those who have perished at its hands. From La Paz, Yungas Road climbs to 15,260 feet, then gradually declines to 3,900 feet at Coroico. These altitude variations mean that travelers experience both humid, tropical conditions and chilly, thin air. One of the toughest things is feeling like you're running out of oxygen. Paraguayan prisoners cut the road into the side of the Cordillera Oriental mountain chain during the 1930s, amid the brutal Chaco War. As the only route between La Paz and the Yungas region until 2006, it was common for buses and trucks to fall over the edge of the single-lane path, with an estimated 200 to 300 people tumbling to their deaths annually. To prevent future tragedies, the Bolivian government spent 20 years modernizing the road, implementing guardrails, 2 driving lanes, pavement, and drainage systems. In 2009, a safer alternative route was constructed. Today, the original road is mostly used by local workers and daredevil cyclists. If that won't get you in shape, I don't know what will. Since 1998, over 22 thrill seekers have lost their lives along the road. Eagle's Nest Cave. Shrouded by pine trees in west central Florida's Chassahowitzka Wildlife Management Area, the Eagle's Nest Cave is a 300-foot deep remote sinkhole with a narrow system of underwater passages that attract avid cave divers. While cave diving is extremely dangerous to begin with, as of October 2016, at least 11 people have died since 1981 while exploring Eagle's Nest Cave, prompting many locals to call for its closure. As deadly as the complex cave system is, however, it's also beautiful, and many are championing for it to remain open. It just has to be at your own risk. Jill Heinerth, one of the world's most experienced cave divers, told National Geographic that this particular dive site is especially dangerous because of how deep it is, giving divers less time to respond effectively to emergencies. Disturbing sediments within the cave can lead to limited visibility, further obstructing one's ability to reach safety when something goes horribly wrong. Simply put, Eagle's Nest Cave is only appropriate for highly experienced cave divers, and the blatant warning sign about the life-threatening nature of diving at this site is there for a reason. Alwick Poison Garden. Surrounded by a locked iron gate bearing a sign that says "These plants can kill you," the Poison Garden at the Alwick Garden in Northumberland, England, features around 100 of the world's most toxic plants. For obvious reasons, guests can only access the Poison Garden via a guided tour. Alwick's official website reads, "Visitors are strictly prohibited from smelling, touching, or tasting any plants, although some people still occasionally faint from inhaling toxic fumes while walking in the garden." Sheesh, really? That sounds like the greenhouse from Hogwarts more than a real place we can visit. Jane Percy, Duchess of Northumberland, created the Poison Garden in 2005 after her husband asked her to do something with the garden outside their home, which dates back to 1750 and fell into disuse in 1950. "I thought this is a way to interest children," Percy told Smithsonian Magazine in a 2014 interview. "Children don't care that aspirin comes from the bark of a tree. What's really interesting is to know how a plant kills you, and how the patient dies, and what you feel like before you die." Plants featured in the garden include foxglove, hemlock, Strychnos nux vomica, the source of strychnine, deadly nightshade, angel's trumpet, coca, from which cocaine is derived, opium poppies, and marijuana. Devil's Pool. Located at the top of the 355-foot Victoria Falls in Zambia, the world's largest waterfall by volume, the Devil's Pool is often described as the ultimate infinity pool. It's also known as the world's most dangerous swimming pool, a reputation that is partially fitting, but also deceptive in some ways. From mid-August to mid-January, a barrier of rocks at the top of the falls prevents swimmers from being swept over and falling to their deaths. At all other times, the water rises too high for the rocks to effectively contain swimmers. Reaching the site requires a short swim through the Zambezi River, where crocodiles and hippos are known to hang out. From there, visitors must maneuver over wet rocks where they sometimes slip and fall. Generally speaking, as long as visitors follow safety rules and common sense guidelines, the Devil's Pool is considered safe. But for those who choose to rebel, it can be dangerous or even deadly, even during the so-called safe season when the water is low. The views are breathtaking, but they're meant to be enjoyed from inside the pool. In an age where tourists are doing increasingly dangerous things for selfies and social media, it's important to remember that pushing the envelope at the Devil's Pool could be especially life-threatening. Feeding crocodiles in Thailand. One day in 2016, as a motorcycle taxi driver named John Nok rode past the Elephant Kingdom in Chonburi, Thailand, he noticed guests perched in a flimsy, makeshift cage atop a ramshackle raft feeding pieces of meat to 10-foot-long crocodiles encircling the enclosure. "I've been a taxi driver for more than 20 years and never seen anything like this before," John told the Mirror. "It looks so dangerous, I just had to take a picture." John's picture, which showed dozens of crocodiles eagerly congregating around the raft, went viral on social media, prompting government officials and police to race to the crocodile farm within hours of its appearance online. The authorities shut the attraction down and suspended its license to further explore the obvious safety concerns associated with it. Although locals and authorities were mostly oblivious to the crocodile farm until then, it was suspected that the attraction had been around for years, serving mainly as a source of entertainment for foreign tourists. Owner Uthun Young Prapakorn revealed that he had started the crocodile feeding raft rides to cater to a growing demand from Chinese visitors. He defended the attraction, saying that there were never any problems and that guests were happy with their experience. Thrilling? Probably, but extremely dangerous. Mont Blanc.
At 15,780 feet high, Mont Blanc is Western Europe's deadliest and second tallest mountain and the highest alpine peak. Nestled in the French Alps, it's a popular destination for hiking, climbing, and winter sports. Despite its height, Mont Blanc is known for being less challenging to climb than many other famous peaks like Everest. Yet it has the highest fatality rate of any mountain in Europe, with an estimated 100 hikers perishing annually. So what gives? Adventure writer Lane Wallace explained in a 2012 article in The Atlantic that Mont Blanc attracts novice hikers who hire professionals to guide them up the peak, under the impression that being physically fit and in the hands of an expert is enough to make the journey safely. This leads to numerous issues, including extremely crowded slopes, especially during the summer. Many people are exposed to the dangers of high altitudes, cold weather, and avalanches, and as they squeeze past other groups along the trails, there are limited and narrow options for footing. Moreover, according to Wallace, overnight spots are difficult to score, resulting in pressure for a team to embark on a hike even in inclement weather or if someone isn't feeling well. Guides operate based on what the writer calls a production line mentality, which entails getting groups up and down the mountain as fast and often as possible. And when lots of people are doing something potentially hazardous, it makes the activity seem much safer than it actually is, causing people to go along with it, unaware of the dangers. Guided hiking is part and parcel to European culture and has a long-standing history in the Alps, where the culture is more risk-tolerant than it is in the US, Ed Crothers of the American Mountain Guides Association told Wallace. The moral of the story? No matter where you are, remember that you're hiking at your own risk. New Smyrna Beach, Florida. Florida beaches are awesome, but this one specifically stands out. Nicknamed the shark attack capital of the world, New Smyrna Beach in Volusia County, Florida is home to over 238 recorded shark bites and attacks. Black-tip sharks are common at New Smyrna Beach because of a nearby inlet that serves as a fertile hunting ground. Anyone who has swum here has likely been within 10 feet of a shark, according to the University of Florida's International Shark Attack File. The sharks bite blindly in response to disturbances because the surf inhibits visibility. Back in February, 33-year-old surfer Jeremy Johnston visited New Smyrna Beach. After spending a short time in the water, he got out and launched his drone to catch some footage of the beach below. Johnston was shocked at the amount of sharks that appeared in the shallow water, with up to a dozen being visible at any given time. More generally, the state of Florida is the unprovoked shark attack capital of the world. In 2019 alone, there were 21 such attacks throughout Florida, with 9 occurring in Volusia County. Kota Trail. Located in Papua New Guinea, the Kota Trail winds through 80 miles of extremely rugged and isolated jungle terrain that would challenge even a very experienced hiker. Most of the steep and rocky single-file path is inaccessible by helicopter, making emergencies even more serious than they normally are in a remote mountainous region. Completing the trail typically takes between 4 and 12 days, so if something goes wrong, you might be waiting a while for help to arrive. A highly experienced guide with access to reliable 24/7 communication is an utmost necessity for trekking the Kota Trail, which reaches 8,169 feet at its highest point, as it wraps around the peak of Mount Bellamy. Daytime along the trail is notoriously hot and humid, while nights can become extremely cold. Torrential downpours and rapidly rising and lowering rivers and creeks further complicate the difficult hike, and trekkers unavoidably put themselves at risk for endemic tropical diseases like malaria. The deaths of 6 Australians in various separate incidents prompted calls for increased oversight of the trail, including a mandatory fitness test for those wishing to complete the hike and mandatory licensing for all guides. Gans, South Africa. Known as the Great White Shark capital of the world, Gans is a fishing town located on South Africa's Western Cape that attracts tourists for whale watching and due to its dense population of great white sharks. Since 1995, visitors have flocked to Gans to cage dive with great whites under the instruction of experts, who teach them all about how the sharks hunt and feed, and how to tell the difference between males and females. During the experience, while coming within inches of the ocean's top apex predator, guests are also likely to encounter dolphins, whales, seals, and penguins. While coming face-to-face with great white sharks is sure to spark an adrenaline rush, it's not as dangerous as it sounds. After all, the sharks can't harm divers from outside a secure steel cage. It has become one of the most popular extreme sports. As many of the shark diving tour companies will point out, it is 100% more likely for you to get killed by an object dropping from the sky than by a great white. There are also important safety briefings before getting dropped into the water. If you try to reach out and touch a shark, that's on you. But in recent years, something even more alarming has happened in Gans. Starting in 2017, cage diving tour companies reported a sudden decline in the great white seen swimming in the area. Scientists are trying to figure out why, although more data gathering is necessary to determine whether the sharks have relocated, if they're being killed in greater numbers, or what other factors may be at play.
Thanks for watching! Be sure to stay tuned for extra content you might have missed.
Dyatlov Pass. In 1959, a group of 10 young hikers ventured into the Ural Mountains and never came out. They were attempting to reach Mount Ortorton when disaster struck. It became one of the most bizarre, unsolved mysteries of the last century. 9 of the 10 explorers didn't make it. There were 7 men and 2 women, most of whom were university students. They were only about 6 miles away from their final destination when something happened that caused the hikers to flee their tent in the middle of the night in minus 30-degree weather. It took 3 months for officials to locate all 9 of the bodies. Some of them were found a mile away from their campsite. Some didn't have shoes or coats. 2 were found with fractured skulls. 2 were found with fractured bones in their chest, and another hiker was missing her tongue. At the time, Russian authorities said the deaths were due to a compelling force of nature and closed the case and never talked about it again. The sole survivor, Yuri Yudin, was also a student at the time and was supposed to climb the pass with the rest of the group, but he got dysentery and had to turn back. Nobody knows exactly what happened that night. Whatever it was caused the hikers to desert their site and split up. 6 of them died from hypothermia. 3 died from injuries. 2 of them were found underneath a cedar tree near the remains of a small campfire. 4 others were found in a ravine about 250 feet away with burns on their hands. 1 of them had their foot wrapped in a cut piece of another one's pants, and yet another was found wearing the coat and hat of somebody else. The clothing was also cut up as if it had been forcibly removed. There were a lot of crazy theories. Some said they were attacked by a mysterious monster. Some say they erupted in a fit of hysteria and ran screaming into the forest. Some also suspect the military because of the hikers' location. Perhaps they saw something they shouldn't have. Yuri Yudin has been racked with guilt his whole life, believing that he should have been there with them. He said many times that the investigation was much more focused on why they were in the area than finding out what happened. He thinks that some sort of testing or weapon killed the group. The incident has since been blamed on an avalanche, but the truth is nobody knows what happened to the 9 hikers that night on the pass. Ada Blackjack. In June of 1923, Ada Blackjack was left for dead on Wrangel Island, Siberia. Just 2 years before, she was living in Nome, Alaska, caring for her young son, the only surviving child that she'd had with her husband, a man who had just recently abandoned her. She was forced to leave her son at a local orphanage until she could find enough money to support him. He was weak and sickly with tuberculosis, and the harsh weather was too much. Then came Vilhjalmur Stephenson, a Canadian explorer who wanted to claim Wrangel Island, Siberia for Britain. This island is about 250 miles west of Alaska and 100 miles north of Siberia. Stephenson gathered a small crew and some provisions, including enlisting the help of Ada Blackjack, and set off for the middle of nowhere. She was to be paid $50 per month, significantly more than she would make doing anything else. At that time, it was unheard of for a woman to go off exploring into the Arctic with strange men she'd never even met before. The local Inuit who were going to accompany the group left, and she was left alone with the 4 explorers who were a bit underprepared. The first couple months of the expedition were okay. The men hunted and set up meteorological equipment and took care of the sled dogs. Ada cooked, kept the camp, and repaired their clothing. Then the winter came. The sunlight vanished and the ice trapped them on the island. Soon the explorers were all alone. The temperature dropped to an unbearable minus 56 degrees at night. They were starving, and one of the men became sick with scurvy. So the other 3 trekked across the ice to Siberia to try to find a ship that would help them. No one ever heard from them again. Ada was left alone caring for the sick man who did nothing but blame her for his troubles, even though she was hunting, bringing firewood, and keeping him warm so he wouldn't get frostbite. For 6 months, she took care of him until he died. Ada then survived on her own for 2 years, hunting and building a new boat out of driftwood and animal skin, trying to make it long enough to see her son again. When a boat finally approached, The crew were shocked to see her there with her camp and a smile on her face. She finally returned home and was reunited with her son. Peng Jiamu. In northwestern China, the Xinjiang region is a great expanse of basically inhospitable nothingness. It's also home to the Lop Nor Desert, which biochemist Peng Jiamu explored in 1964. With help from the Chinese Academy of Sciences, an expedition was set up for Peng. He went by car, donkey, canoe, and on foot to measure the potassium levels in the desert. He went on a second expedition into the Lop Nor Desert in the summer of 1980, but it was rough. He had a small team of scientists with him, and their water quickly began to run out. The scientists wanted to turn around, but Peng refused. 5 days later, when the water really did run out, Peng vanished. A note was found in his tent saying he went out to search for a source of water, but he never came back. This wasn't that long ago, and so the government had the ability to send out a huge search team to try and find the missing scientist, but they never found him. To this day, the scientist is missing and presumed dead. Every now and then, a human skeleton is found by someone else in the Lop Nor Desert and passed off as Peng Jiamu, but experts believe his body has probably already been mummified and buried by the desert sand. The Narvaez Expedition. Álvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca was an early Spanish explorer during the 1500s. In 1527, the Spanish court appointed an expedition led by conquistador Pánfilo de Narváez with a contract from the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V of Spain that gave him permission to settle and colonize a piece of land between Florida and Rio Soto la Marina. They set out with 5 ships and 600 soldiers and colonists, ready to settle the New World. The expedition landed in Florida on April 15, 1528. When they stopped in Hispaniola to get supplies, 150 men decided to stay. The journey across the sea had been too much, so the expedition continued to Cuba to get horses and recruit more men. Narváez ordered Cabeza de Vaca to take 2 ships and continue on. In Trinidad, a hurricane hit, destroying the ships and killing 60 men and 20 horses. Narváez ordered Cabeza de Vaca to stay in Cuba and take command of the 4 remaining ships while the rest went to go find more men and replace the lost ships. Finally, they made it to Florida to what is now Tampa Bay. By now, there were cracks in the leadership when Narváez ordered everyone to get off the ships, separate into 2 groups, and start marching. Cabeza de Vaca argued that the soldiers shouldn't leave the ships until they were in a known harbor, and if they got separated, they would never find their way back. In any case, the leader won out, and everybody started off into the Florida wilderness. They were out marching for 4 months, facing swamps and mosquitoes, and over 50 men died. The Spaniards were miserable. They had no food, and they had to eat all their horses that they had spent so much time trying to get. They got completely lost with no way to find the coast or their ships where they had left them. Native communities were sometimes friendly, but made it clear that they wanted the invaders to leave. Over time, the Spanish tried to capture a town belonging to the Appalachee where there was plenty of corn and food to eat. This tribe was having none of it and attacked the group. The survivors continued wandering around trying to find shelter and food, encountering natives who would take them hostage and attack, while all the while they were trying to find their way back to their ships. The Spanish tried to build rafts to go down rivers to get to the sea, and tried to look for other civilizations. Somehow they ended up in Texas, most likely Galveston, which they called the Isle of Misfortune. They were rescued by a native group, but the misery was far from over. The tribe helped them to recover their health, but then made them all slaves, and they were all separated. Cabeza de Vaca learned there were about 80 survivors, all held as slaves. By 1529, there were only 13 Spaniards and 1 African slave still alive in the party. It was not at all what the explorers had expected. In the end, only 4 of the Spaniards would survive the worst expedition ever. Apollo 1. The Apollo 1 mission was the very first crewed mission involved in the Apollo program. The ultimate goal was a lunar landing, what you might consider the most ambitious expedition in human history. The space race was in full force, and the United States desperately wanted to get a man on the moon. But this moon expedition would turn into a national tragedy. It happened at the Cape Kennedy Air Force Station. During a launch rehearsal test on January 27, 1967, a fire erupted in the cabin, and 3 of the crew members were brutally killed inside of the command module. Even today, experts still debate what really caused the fire. It had something to do with the fact that inside the Apollo 1 spacecraft there was pure oxygen. Something happened during the test that caused a spark. And in an atmosphere of pure oxygen, that means instant fire. The air literally turned to flame and the 3 astronauts died. In 2017, NASA held a special ceremony to honor the 50th anniversary of the brave astronauts' deaths. The Franklin Expedition. The Franklin Expedition is perhaps the most legendary doomed expedition in history. The HMS Terror and the HMS Erebus set off from England on May 19, 1845. In total, there were 133 men under the command of Sir John Franklin. Their mission was to locate and transit through the Northwest Passage, a path that goes from the Atlantic to the Pacific through the Arctic inlets of northern Canada. It was a mission of great import, something Europeans had been trying to do for centuries. They wanted a shorter way to go east, without having to go around the entire continent of Africa. The mission was a complete failure, and to this day the Northwest Passage is still a treacherous place, and really not a good route for trade. The disaster happened just a few months after the ship set sail. They became stuck in the ice. As winter descended upon the Arctic, the ice solidified and trapped the ships, and never let them go. The men eventually ran out of supplies, began dying and getting sick, and they abandoned both vessels and embarked on a journey across the Arctic in search of help. What they found instead was a nightmare of cannibalism and sickness. Every last member of the expedition died a slow, cold death. The ships were found 170 years later by Canadian archaeologists, still preserved in the icy waters. The Terra Nova Expedition. Robert Falcon Scott was a British explorer that tried to reach the South Pole in 1910. He hoped to be the first one to get there. At the time, reaching the South Pole had turned into quite the race, with Ernest Shackleton coming within just 100 miles of the pole the year before Robert set out. Robert embarked on what was called the Terra Nova Expedition. The ship landed on Antarctica, south of New Zealand, in January of 1911. Things started going badly immediately. There were harsh blizzards and almost all of their horses died. The temperatures reached around minus 77 degrees. By the time the small polar crew finally made it to the South Pole in January of 1912, after enduring a miserable year of cold and ice, they were devastated to find a black flag sticking out of the ground. Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen had beaten them to it by a month. They found the empty camp at the pole, making them the second party to discover it. The crew was pretty upset that they weren't the first ones to get to the South Pole. Then things got even worse. When they tried to get back to base camp, one of them got severe frostbite and collapsed dead. Later on, a second man lost the use of his hands from frostbite and died. The 3 remaining explorers, including Robert Falcon Scott, never made it back to camp. They died together, huddled in a tent. Dr. Livingstone and the African King. David Livingstone was a famous explorer who went on a journey of a lifetime. He traveled across Africa exploring lands that were previously unknown to European eyes. In fact, his heart is literally buried in Africa under a tree. His journey through Zambezi was particularly interesting. This was when he named Victoria Falls, one of the biggest waterfalls in the entire world, after the British Queen. However, Livingstone nearly died and would never have made it out of the jungle if not for a 19-year-old African king that almost nobody has heard of. Sekeletu was the newly appointed leader of the Kololo people in what is today Zambia. To understand a bit about Dr. Livingstone's problems, it's important to know that he traveled light. He brought with him only a handful of porters to carry things and neglected to bring along any food or supplies. When he came into this African kingdom, he had with him a pretty small supply of beads, clothes, and cloth for trade, and all of this ran out. He ended up becoming utterly dependent on the boy king, who gave Dr. Livingstone aid and assisted him in his adventure. If not for the king's generosity, Livingstone would have surely died of starvation, or maybe even worse. The first Everest expedition. In 1924, there was a British expedition to finally conquer Mount Everest. There was another expedition 2 years prior that had failed, and climbers were feeling confident that 1924 would be the year to succeed. This time, the men were planning to fully ascend the mountain using bottled oxygen. They were to climb the mountain starting from Tibet, since at the time Nepal was a closed country and foreigners weren't allowed in. George Mallory was a seasoned climber and believed he could get the team to the top. He was joined by Andrew Irvine, who had absolutely no climbing experience, but he did know how to use the special oxygen apparatus that would allow the men to breathe while trying to get to the top of the mountain. The 2 men were last spotted in the early afternoon of June 8th. They set off at 23,100 feet, with high hopes and in good spirits. They were never seen again. It's believed the two men did reach the summit but had issues getting down and were lost forever under the snow. Several years later, an ice axe was discovered at 27,750 feet, believed to have belonged to Irvine. But it wouldn't be until 1975 that a body was found, 750 feet below the axe by a Chinese climber. It was confirmed to be Andrew Irvine, but to this day, nobody has found any trace of George Mallory. Theodore Roosevelt's jungle adventure. Theodore Roosevelt was arguably the most adventurous president in the history of the United States of America. In 1913, he was 55 years old when he decided to go deep into the jungles of Brazil into uncharted territory. He describes it at the time as his last chance to be a boy. It was also something of a consolation prize to himself after losing out his third term as president in that same year. Roosevelt journeyed along what is known today as the River of Doubt, with a small party in dugout canoes. They were tormented endlessly by mosquitoes and stinging flies, constantly at risk of alligator attacks, and there was always the lingering possibility that they would be killed by hostile native tribes. He was almost bitten by a venomous coral snake that sunk its teeth into his leather boot. They eventually hit rapids, their canoes were destroyed, and they had to build new ones in the jungle. One guy drowned in a whirlpool, and around this time they realized they were being stalked by the natives. The natives shot and killed one of their dogs with arrows. Almost everyone came down with malaria, and Roosevelt himself came down with a fever after cutting open his leg on a rock. One of the porters shot and killed a Brazilian man and then ran off into the jungle and was never seen again. It turned into a fight for survival. By the time the expedition of 19 men finally made it back to civilization, Roosevelt had lost a quarter of his weight. It was such a harrowing journey that Roosevelt never went on another expedition again, though he did try to volunteer to fight in World War I.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to stay tuned for extra content you might have missed.
Fanjingshan Temple. Mount Fanjingshan in China's Guizhou province is one of the most remote places in the entire world. It's also one of the most magical. The mountain is the highest peak in the Wuling Mountains of southeastern China, at an elevation of 8,430 feet. But it's not the peak itself that makes this such a remarkable place, but rather the Buddhist temple at the top that looks like something you typically only see in a fantasy movie or a dream. Perched at the very top of the mountain, what the locals call Red Cloud Golden Peak, is the unbelievable Fanjingshan Temple. The peak is divided by a huge crevice, looking like two stony fingers piercing the sky. And on the tip of each finger is a temple, with a small bridge connecting them over a massive drop to certain death. There is the Temple of the Buddha and the Temple of Maitreya, one for worshipping the present and the other for the future. The temples were built about 500 years ago during the Ming Dynasty. They were built using the strongest iron tiles to protect them from the furious winds at such a high elevation. The view from the top is spectacular, with sweeping panoramas of the remote mountains on every side. The only way to get there is by climbing thousands of stairs up the steep cliffs. The whole place is usually covered in a sea of mist and clouds. You can only see into the distance on extremely clear days. Otherwise, you're pretty much standing inside of the clouds themselves. Rainbow Reef. Fiji is one of the most remote islands in the world, over 2,700 miles from Hawaii. It makes sense then that Fiji is home to one of the most secluded coral reefs ever discovered. It's called the Rainbow Reef, and it was found by none other than Jacques Cousteau. The water here is a beautiful turquoise. There are over 230 types of hard and soft coral, and at least 1,200 species of exotic fish. It's considered the best place to dive in the world for those interested in seeing a pristine paradise of marine life. One of the reasons it's so clean and pristine is its remoteness, as it's nearly impossible for an average person to fly to the middle of the ocean just to go diving. Rainbow Reef has yet to be spoiled by mass tourism and pollution. One of the greatest features of the Rainbow Reef is the Great White Wall. It's a solid wall of soft coral stretching beneath the surface of the turquoise waters over 90 feet. The current here is so strong that you can be swept off into the ocean and never seen again. But it's almost worth the risk just to witness the beauty. The Purple Russian Volcano. Deep in the Russian wilderness, far from any city and tourist cameras, there's a volcano that turns the sky purple. The volcano erupted in June of 2019 and spewed sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. According to researchers from the University of Colorado, the sulfur dioxide created small particles of aerosols, which scattered sunlight sifting through the atmosphere to birth beautiful hues of purple during the sunrise and sunset. The volcano is called Reikoke, and it can be found on the Kuril Island chain in the remote wasteland of the Kamchatka Peninsula. When it erupted in 2019, it released steam and gas over 1.2 miles into the air. It was its first eruption since 1924, and because of its isolated location, there was very little threat to any airplanes or humans. But its volcanic ash plume did reach 8 miles high, well into the stratosphere. While most people in North America have no idea what was happening, those living in northern Russia were given a spectacular purple sunset, the likes of which they'll probably never see again in their lifetimes. But here's one more important fact. While the aerosol in the atmosphere painted beautiful plum sunsets this time, too much of that same aerosol can be dangerous. In 1815, Mount Tambora in Indonesia filled the atmosphere with so many aerosols that it caused global crop failure, famine, and strife. Batanes. Batanes is the most remote island region in all the Philippines. Considering the Philippines is nothing but a network of islands, that's really saying something. The islands of Batanes are technically closer to Taiwan than the rest of the island country. But here's what's really interesting about Batanes, which by the way is the name of the province, not of any of the islands. The islands don't even look like the rest of the Philippines. Forget about white sandy beaches and swaying palm trees. The Batanes Islands look a lot more like the Scottish Highlands. There are emerald hills dotted with quiet cattle and roaming sheep, and quaint towns built out of stone like early English villages. Paths are lined with flowers, there are craggy cliffs where the sea thrashes against their bulks, and even lighthouses standing on chunks of rock just waiting to fall over. It's a kind of magical place that brings to mind visions of Viking exploration more than backpackers and banana plantations. One of the most unique aspects of the islands is that they produce just enough food to feed their own population. There is a complete absence of markets, with the locals working only for themselves and to take care of the community. They fish just enough to feed themselves, don't worry about making any money, and live almost entirely off the land. And now for number 6. But first, want to give a big shout out to Lisa Turner and Chad Rodoni. Thanks so much for watching and supporting Origins Explained. If you are new here, welcome, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Arim. Arim is a remote archaeological site in Russia that dates back to roughly 2050 BC. Researchers believe it was the Sintashta culture who built this place at the foot of the Ural Mountains, quite near to the borderlands of Kazakhstan, where the land swells in green waves of tiny hills. The site was first found in 1987, but it's hardly been studied. The Sintashta culture were an early group of Indo-Iranians before they split into different factions and migrated throughout the region. That means the Sintashta culture were the original Persians. They migrated 4,000 years ago from southern Russia into Central Asia, and from there made their way into Persia, India, and other parts of Eurasia. But what exactly was the site used for? Archaeologists believe it was a megalithic stronghold. They have found evidence of over 60 dwellings, furnaces used for smelting metal, circular streets that had been paved with wood, and even drainage gutters to help with waste management and the collection of water. This was a major city that utilized advanced technologies. Scholars have identified Arim as one of the very first planned cities, one occupied by a society with a highly developed social structure. There would have been local leaders and some kind of spiritual activity, but nobody's sure what religious beliefs they held. We're also not sure why the city was abandoned. It could have had something to do with an invasion. And it also could have been that the Sintashta culture migrated south, looking for more prosperous lands. Penny Rock. Penny Rock is a bizarre state attraction in the south of Pennsylvania, located in Salt Springs State Park. It's far from any of the main roads, and as of 2021, completely unreachable. There was an issue with the bridge leading to it, and it's unclear whether the bridge has been fixed yet. Salt Springs State Park is a pretty fascinating place. It's filled with spectacular waterfalls and beautiful hiking trails. And of course, there is also the salt springs. The Native American Onondaga people used the area for mining salt for trade with other groups many hundreds of years ago. One of the springs in the park is the start for the Hemlock Trail, which leads through a deep forest of tall hemlock trees over 300 years old. And rooted inside of this dark and slightly spooky grove is a gigantic boulder. This is Penny Rock, and for some totally bizarre reason, the boulder is covered in pennies. For decades, visitors have been jamming and pounding pennies into grooves and crevices on the boulder. The myth is that by leaving your penny smashed into the rock, you will gain good fortune. And by prying a penny out of the rock, you can give yourself a lifetime of bad luck. The Lost Maya. The ruins of a gigantic Maya city were recently found in a lonely part of the jungle in southeast Mexico. Archaeologists found broken pyramids, shattered plazas, and the remains of brick walls that had once been marvelous palaces. But to be honest, the ruins are extremely easy to miss. The whole place is covered in thick vegetation, almost completely reabsorbed by the jungle. A few more years and the stone will decay completely, and there won't be a single trace left of the great civilization that once lived here. The ruins were found deep in the jungle near Campeche, on Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula. This is a place already littered with ancient Maya cities and mysterious burial sites. The new city has been named Chactun, and it was occupied around the year 600 AD up until the collapse of the Maya in 900. According to archaeologist Ivan Sprach from Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History, the city is one of the largest sites in the central lowlands, comparable in size and magnitude to cities like El Palmar and Nazcan. It was almost definitely a major center for commerce and culture. One of the pyramids was so big that when it was finished over 1,000 years ago, it stood 75 feet tall. Bugs on the beach. On an extremely remote island beach, scientists have discovered a deadly hospital superbug. It's the first time researchers have seen this particular organism in the wild. It's called Candida auris, and it mysteriously appeared in hospitals all over the globe about a year ago. According to Dr. Arturo Casadeval at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health in Baltimore, the organism is a complete medical mystery. But now that they have discovered its natural habitat on a random stretch of beach, scientists are hoping to put together the puzzle and figure out the origin of the superbug. If you're a little confused, I'll try to explain. The superbug is a fungus, and it was first found in 2009 in Japan. From there, it spread across the globe and caused bloodstream infections in patients. It's an absolute nightmare of an infection, and nobody knows how it reached so many hospitals around the world. We also don't know why it lives on the beach. It was discovered by medical mycologist Dr. Anuradha Chowdhury in the Andaman Islands, which is a remote tropical archipelago found off the coast of India. It's not a popular tourist destination. It's about as tropical and remote as you can get, and the closest a person can be to actually being stranded on a deserted island. You just better hope you don't get sick while on one of these islands, since the sand is crawling with microscopic superbugs. Lost Bhutan. In the remote and isolated mountains of Bhutan, archaeologists came across a ruined zong from the 16th century. This was a unique type of architectural building specific to Bhutan and Tibet, something like a fortified Buddhist monastery. There are dozens and even hundreds of these things scattered across Tibet and Bhutan, but most have been reduced to ruins. This one is no exception, with very few structural walls still standing, and most of the site nothing but scattered bricks and chunks of rock. It was likely a gigantic fortress starting around 1550 and thrived up until the 1700s. It would have resembled a mix between a traditional Buddhist temple and a medieval castle. Researchers believe that Zong was built by Chokor Deb, the local ruler of the Chokor-to Valley. This was an ancient passage leading between Bhutan and Tibet. It would have been from this fortification that a huge garrison of over 2,000 men was stationed to protect Bhutan from invasion, as well as to regulate any trade moving in and out of their territory. The Majorville Medicine Wheel. In the Canadian province of Alberta, there is an ancient monument called the Majorville Medicine Wheel, or the Iniskim Umapi. It was built over 4,500 years ago, and it's almost impossible to get to. The only way to reach this long-lost remnant of Native American culture is by driving a 4x4 vehicle into the very heart of the prairies, down an old dirt track that looks like it's only been used by donkeys and merchant caravans. There is no civilization to speak of out here, and nothing but the wind, the grass, and the cacti. To the untrained eye, the medicine wheel doesn't even look like anything. If you were to pass by here not knowing what it was, you would just think it was strange that a large pile of rocks was piled up in the middle of the unending field. But in truth, these stones were added here thousands of years before Europeans ever made it to the shores of North America. It's one of the oldest known structures in Canada, a ruined cairn surrounded by a circle of 28 spokes. Historians say medicine wheels were used by different Native American tribes for a variety of reasons, primarily for health and healing. Some medicine wheels were painted. Some were made by piling rocks together, and others were carved into the dirt. The Majorville medicine wheel was made by the ancestors of the Blackfoot Nation, and is only one of about 70 still remaining in North America. This is one of only 3 built from mounds of stones. To this very day, the Majorville medicine wheel is considered a sacred place by the Native Americans in Alberta. Visiting the hill where the stones are is like a sacred pilgrimage and a spiritual journey even to non-Native Americans as they delve deep into the ancient grasslands of northern Canada. Thanks for watching! Which of these remote places would you love to visit for yourself? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. See you soon! Bye!